Can you explain how we should understand Iran's political system today, not through the Western caricatures, but in its actual complexity? Iran is often described in US media as a theocratic dictatorship. You've challenged this oversimplification while acknowledging authoritarian features. What kind of state structure are we really dealing with, and how does it function, especially during war or foreign aggression?
Thank you for that question. It's an important question. Yeah, Iran's political structure is, maybe you could say it's a hybrid political structure. It has elements of Republican / democratic participation or, institutions in it. And it also has parallel institutions that are given power by the religious establishment of Iran to have either overseeing responsibilities over the elected institutions or sometimes even have more power over them. So those institutions that are very important, for instance, is the institution, for instance, of the leadership. It's called supreme leader in the West, but we don't use that term in Iran. When we refer to Ayatollah Khamenei and prior to him, Ayatollah Khomeini, we just say the leader. Now, that leadership position has, you could say, the ultimate authority on matters of war and peace and national security and some domestic, let's say, issues as well. But we do have in Iran the office of presidency, which is elected. Iran, since its revolution in 1979, has had very regular electoral processes which have elected presidents from back in early 90s continuously till today. Then you have legislative, for instance, branch of Iran's government, and that again involves elections, public participation. But at the same time, you have another parallel institution like the Guardian Council, for instance, that has an ability to vet people who would want to, let's say, hold office or nominate themselves. It also has the ability to oversee legislation to see whether or not it meets the standards by which they judge legislation. And if it doesn't, the legislation can go back and forth between the Guardian Council and back to the legislators to make some amendments that might satisfy the Guardian Council. So they have these sorts of complicated mechanisms that are not something that Americans or North Americans or Europeans are familiar with. It's a cumbersome, governing system, machinery, and it has produced limited, I would say, choices in areas that are important to the electorate, let's say in the area of economics or foreign policy and stuff like that. And it's not surprising that it has limited choices for people because most electoral systems that I know of, including the one in the United States, has the same feature. Different mechanisms, but limited choices for the public. So there's a lot of hypocrisy in my mind when Westerners talk about Iranian system. First of all, they simplify it, as you mentioned, in terms of, it's a theocratic system, and they ignore the Republican aspects of it. And secondarily, when they talk about Iran in this way, it's as if they're saying Iran's electoral system and the limited choices that it offers its public, it's unique. But they don't look in the mirror to see that they actually have the same kind of outcomes in their own electoral system for different reasons. For instance, in the US, you might say the vetting takes place by the donor class or the capitalist class, those who own the country and own the resources of the country. They get to say in the final analysis, who gets to run and what policies are, the outcome of their electoral system.
We're speaking just after a U.S. brokered ceasefire ended, 12 days of bombing between Israel and Iran, an escalation that brought not only global attention to the limits of diplomacy, the collapse of international law, increasingly open warfare targeting the global South. What does this 12-day war reveal about the current state of the U.S. empire and its capacity to manage global conflicts?
Another good question. Well, I suppose I would begin by saying that the Euro-American imperialism is in decline. And one of the signs of its decline is that For instance, it could have resolved the issue of Iran's nuclear so-called problem diplomatically, and it resorted to violence instead. And what we ended up with this situation where maybe 600 Iranians died, maybe even more, and many, many more were wounded. Iran's internal politics has now, I think, towards much more of a united public against the Euro-imperialist project. Now, none of these things should have happened if the empire had a consciousness of some form of rationality, let's say, that it could have achieved some of its goals without the cost that it now has incurred. So there's a problem with the imperial consciousness to begin with, which sees the world in terms of the colonial psyche, that, the colonizers will control the rest of the world and the rest of the world has to be subservient to them. That existed in the past in the long-term perspective about colonialism, but that it makes mistakes, that imposes cost on them increasingly on an accelerated rate, that I think could be viewed as a sign of weakness. So that's what I would say.
And there's a permanent, I guess you could say, encirclement that shapes Iran's posture in the region. And Iran is encircled by U.S. military bases across Qatar, Iraq, Kuwait, Afghanistan until recently, and the Persian Gulf. How does this permanent encirclement shape Iran's posture in the region? And what does resistance mean for a state under constant surveillance, sanctions, and threat of war?
Yeah, very difficult. Well, Iran is not stranger to anti-colonial forms of politics. And in fact, you might say that such perspectives developing in the 50s and 60s and 70s in the region and also in Iran, located in West Asia, were the grounds by which a revolutionary process toppled the old regime and established a post-revolutionary state in Iran. So Iran is quite familiar with forms of anti-colonial politics, whether they're like liberal anti-colonial politics or more radical anti-colonial politics of various kinds, Islamist or secular. So this is the background of Iran's consciousness, and there's nothing new there. Of course, inside Iran, it's a very complicated society, 90-some million people, vast territory, and subjected over the decades to a lot of broadcasting from abroad, including Iranian expats who lost, for instance, their wealth in Iran. They're monarchists and stuff, and they would like to see changes. So there's a lot of impact on Iran's consciousness at the moment. And so there are divisions inside Iran as to how to go forward. There are segments of Iranian public, mostly like in northern parts of cities, more well-to-do areas, richer people, who would like to see a rapprochement with the West, and they would like to see foreign investment, European and American foreign investment, to be free to come inside Iran. They see their own economic interest tied with that sort of prospect. And at the same time, you have people who still adhere to the anti-colonial perspective and the traditions, and there's a back and forth between them. But I think the recent event, this 12-day war, have discredited the group that wants to see the rapprochement with the West, because now they saw the violence that could be visited upon them. And it's not over, obviously. We know that, for instance, the chief of staff of Israel has just said the other day that what we witnessed in the past 12 days was just one phase of their policies in relation to Iran, and this ceasefire is not going to last. Of course, we don't need the chief of staff's acknowledgement, because we also know from history of ceasefires with Israel that they will always violate these ceasefires. They've done so with Hamas in Gaza, and they've done so with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I think in their mind, the Lebanese and the Hamas model of ceasefire is what they are envisioning for Iran. So many Iranians are now coming to acknowledge these facts on the ground. But at the same time, I was just listening to another podcast with Iranians, and there are some voices that are now saying that perhaps what I just said about this consciousness shifting is true, but there might be a possibility in their mind that Trump is a different creature, and that they might be able to please him by negotiating with him in the way he likes and giving him all the praise that he wants to, usually get from various people around him, including, for instance, let's say because of what happened with the International Atomic Energy Agency with Iran right prior
Hmm.
to the 12-day war. And apparently Iran said they had a cache of information that they obtained from the agency, and it showed that the agency was collaborating behind closed doors with Israel, and it was taking information from inside Iran, including locations of scientists and other things, and passing it to Israel. Israel then used it as target, to take them down in Iran. And so Iran is very upset about Grossi and the IAEA. So these
Yeah.
people are now saying, well, maybe post ceasefire, Iran should not have any relationship with the IAEA anymore, but have a direct relationship instead with the Atomic Energy of United States, associations of the United States. So direct negotiations with the U.S. atomic energy sort of pleases Trump. So there's all sorts of things that are now shifting inside Iran. To answer your question about how Iran will respond, I don't see there's a singularity of opinion, although there is a consensus now more than ever based on one, unity of purpose among Iranians to defend Iran against future attacks, and at the same time also a greater depth of understanding in terms of what Euro-American slash Zionist, imperial projects might have in store for Iran.
I think you've also written that Iran is part of a broader arc of resistance,
Mhm.
including Lebanon, Yemen, and Palestine, but it also faces political isolation. How does Iran navigate the contradictions of being both a state actor and a symbolic figure in the anti-US Israeli resistance?
No, I think you're right. Iran is obviously part of the so-called axis, self-declared axis of resistance. And that I think should remain, if someone asks my opinion, because what
Yeah.
matters in the West Asian politics, of course, the greatest old wound of that region is the plight of Palestinians.
Hmm.
And one of the things that people like me appreciate about Iran's foreign policy is that in Iran's foreign policy, Palestine was central. Now, of
Hmm.
course, the politics of Palestinian resistance to Israel has shifted over the decades from what it used to be a secular form of radical politics opposing the Greater Israel Project and the ethnic cleansing and the genocidal project of Zionism to more like an Islamist orientation. But that's the way things have shifted, and Iran represents that pole. Now, outside of the axis of resistance issue, Iran, I think in the past 12 days during this episode of war between Iran and Israel, realized that it is very much in an isolated position when it comes to military alliances. And
Hmm.
right now, today, I think in the United Nations, if you were paying attention, Chinese and Russian representatives were verbally placing themselves in favor of Iran and condemning Israel and United States, which is a good thing. But Iran also realized that in that 12-day period, no one really came to its aid militarily. And so that's something that Iran has to ponder, because all of its technical and defensive abilities mostly were indigenous and native developments to Iran. And of course, Iran is under sanctions. And so there's great restraints on how Iran can, let's say, rebuild its defenses without the alliances that it probably needs, I think, in terms of the race against time before the Israelis violate the ceasefire again and attempt to do something similar to Iran in the last 10 or 12 days that we've seen. So there's a lot of things for Iran to decide in terms of its orientation. What do we do with Trump as a unique president of United States? Depending on what happens to Trump internally in the United States, because he's now under a lot of attack from various corners, including part of his own constituency, and also whether or not Iran would have to make a decision, much more decisive decision, to move towards and shift its policies and alliances much more securely towards the global south. And there's a division on that. People who say, yes, Iran should move more securely towards global south. And there are others who are saying, well, maybe Trump represents a different kind of opportunity. So we'll have to see what comes out of that.